I'm really delighted that we're hosting this talk that promises to be really fascinating. So we're going to be hearing tonight about the woodcut print in Germany after World War I. And this event is part of the Wiener Library's event series for our current exhibition, Fred Kormis, Sculpting the 20th Century. So hopefully you've had a chance to have a look around that. The connection with Fred Kormis will kind of become clear, I think, in the talk. But this exhibition is drawn from a collection of photographs and documents that were donated to us shortly after the death of the sculptor and printmaker Fred or Fritz Kormis, who'd come as a refugee from Nazism to Britain in 1934. We've also borrowed some artworks from various institutions as well for the exhibition. So there's a few more events to follow in the event series. You can find out more, particularly online. I think there's also a poster that refers to some further events that we've got later this year. We've got a couple of events coming up in January as well, so I hope to see you there. Yeah, just to say that we have a busy program in general of events and exhibitions and other talks and so on, not just exhibition talks. So again, find out more on our website. So just a few very basic kind of practical things about the event tonight. So if you need the toilets, you need to leave this room, and then there's an obvious sign pointing down to the basement where the toilets are. Unfortunately, our lift is out of order at the moment. Also, if the alarm should sound, so if the fire alarm should sound, there's only one fire exit, so you need to just leave this room and then go back out of the building through the main entrance, through the entrance that you came through. So yes, turning to the event tonight, I'm really delighted that Nicholas Shearman agreed to do this talk and has worked to look at Kormis in the context of other people making woodcut prints at this particular point in time, and also with maybe similar sort of themes to Kormis too. So really pleased to welcome her here to the library tonight. So Dr. Nicholas Shearman is a historian of 20th century European art with a focus on Germany and Austria to 1945. She has taught a variety of undergraduate courses at the Courtauld Institute and at the University of Manchester, and is a regular contributor to Courtauld short courses and to the V&A Academy. Nicola's PhD concerned the intense wave of woodcut printmaking in the aftermath of the First World War in Germany. She has published articles on this subject and on related themes of art and empathy. Her further research interests lie in the art of modernist Vienna and in the careers of Viennese exiles to the UK under the rise of Nazism. So I'll hand over now to Nicola. There'll be a chance for some questions at the end as well.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Can everyone hear me clearly? Good, excellent. Well, it's a great honor to be asked to speak in this context about a subject that I have been interested in for a long time. And I have to say, I knew nothing until this exhibition came on about the production of artworks in prisoner of war camps actually during the First World War, which is obviously how Fred Kormis originally came to make prints. More of that as I talk. So when in the aftermath of the First World War, virtually the only viable artworks were those on paper, original printmaking took on an exceptional significance. Of the various techniques, the woodcut came out on top, cheap to produce, with associations with medieval artisans from an idealized Gothic past, and also importantly, resonant of an honest materiality after untold technological horrors during the war. As an original member of the Brücke group of Expressionists, founded in 1905, Erich Heckel had been there at the beginning of the woodcut revival. And if you have any idea about those early expressionist groups, then you might have in mind Arcadian images and vibrant colors. Of course, any of that is definitively banished by 1917, when Erich Heckel had already served 3 years as a medical orderly on the Western Front. barely daring to look through those worn hands that hold up the furrowed brow. This figure apparently is the only one left in a landscape, pitted and furrowed likewise with the unmistakable scars of battle. Reduced to an essential pictorial vocabulary of brittle black and white lines, gouges, and rudimentary planes, one might say the medium here matches the message. And I have a suspicion this image might also recall in your minds the work The Scream by the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch. In this exhibition, you will see the woodcut prints of produced around the same date by Fred Kormis during his long period of captivity in Siberia. And it's this parallel that I take as my starting point for a lecture that presents the context of printmaking in the years around 1918, and with a particular focus on the woodcut, which for artists and critics alike appeared to touch a common nerve. The opening section examines a series of works for the way in which they register the shock of volatile times. And I then move on to concentrate on the work of Ernst Barlach and Käthe Kollwitz, two artists particularly admired by Fred Kormis. And in that analysis, I shall consider the reparative psychological strengths associated both with their woodcut practice and with sculpture. So in the response to war, and here are two exemplary examples, it seems apparent that stark conditions and raw wounds demand a medium that can withstand the force of such expression. Observe in Christian Rolf's print the bare anguish of the figure who grasps the rigid prison bars. And in Haeckel's Wounded Men, the splintered lines that indicate the ravaged face, bandaged and broken bodies of those soldiers. Now, these features are in fact integral to the medium of woodcut. It's both its material qualities and the technical restrictions that these impose on the artist. So said many critics, in fact, who seized upon an apparent match between the uncompromising art form and the bruised sensibilities of their public. And I'm going to quote for you the director of the major print collection in Berlin in 1920, Kurt Glaser, who wrote that it is characteristic that the woodcut should take on new significance in these times. For since by its nature, it resists every, I forgot to set my timer. But since, I'll start again with my quote, excuse me. It is characteristic that the woodcut should take on new significance in these times. For since by its nature, it resists every sketchy aspect of pictorial expression and demands, in direct refutation of everything that a painterly art stood for, and demands an emphatic definition and precision of boundaries, then for all these reasons, it is all the more suited to the new artistic intentions. It has become, in no uncertain terms, the emblem of the new art. Now, Carl Schmidt-Rockloof was another former member of that prominent group of expressionists known as Die Brücke, or the bridge, in the pre-war years. Alongside Haeckel and the famous Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, his investment in the material went beyond the print. They were known to produce their own rudimentary carvings, furniture, sculpture, and so forth. And they were also known, these artists, and you see some of it here, they were also known for an exaggerated enthusiasm for the art of other non-European cultures. This is a tendency that today we regard through the critical lens of primitivism, and it prioritized and made assumptions about so-called simple, authentic ways of life and also modes of art that then resonate, especially in the carving techniques of this group of artists. But that element of primitivism, in fact, could just as well apply to their affinities for peasant culture in Northern Europe. The romantic image, for instance, of rural communities living closer to nature inspired creative material relationships that were fundamental to the development of woodcut printing. Now, after 1914, Schmidt-Rottluff was posted in the propaganda office of the Northeastern Front. And there, amidst the dense Lithuanian forests, he adopted a distinct reverence for the local people and produced works which suggest a deep sense of redemption that he found there, culminating in a striking series of 9 woodcuts produced as a portfolio in 1919. The example I'm showing you here, and there's one more to come in the next slide, this is unmistakably a depiction of St. Francis of Assisi, showing us the stigmata that he has received in emulation of the martyrdom, or at least the deep divinity of Christ. And together, this group of woodcuts condense all the influences into a powerful visual statement that bears witness to the suffering in gestures both of Christian martyrdom and a sense of socialist brotherhood. Writing of his work and how he felt even more compelled to work in woodcut, he wrote at the time in a diary how, I'm quoting, "In an elemental way, I have noticed that I have to adopt stronger forms, so strong that they can withhold the sheer force of such national madness." And this is a sentiment, as you will see, that applies to numerous artists working in this medium. The sense of messianic hope that continues in this series, and this, again, it's a New Testament theme, the miraculous draught of fishes, that continues here, is actually very characteristic of an era in which the depths of despair brought on by war are met by an equivalent utopian sense of utopian promise. It's as if there's a roller coaster of emotions at this time. And such urgent sentiments do indeed appear to find their medium in an art form that itself deals in absolutes, a simple choice of black and white with no gray areas. Expressionist critics, of course, did not hold back in their transports, which also match that equivalent sort of emotional roller coaster that I have just described. They are proclaiming this art form to be variously a gospel of truth, to be, for instance, at once burning with actuality in its political relevance, while also, by the way, recalling the spiritual honesty of an idealized German Middle Ages. In some cases, this response extended to a visceral sense of wounding, in fact, as if a perception of the force applied by crude tools to the woodblock induces something in the viewer that is akin to both a body blow and a mystical entreaty. For example, a critic writing about, oops, I moved on by mistake. A critic writing about those same works by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff would write in ecstatic terms, I'll quote here, how each cut of the knife is a cut into the inner self. The wood is indeed flesh of thy flesh. You no doubt see what I mean about this very expressionist exaggeration. A contemporary art historian in America, Reinhold Heller, reviewing this potent formula of Christian martyrdom and primitive material qualities and socialist sentiments, has pointed out that for this generation, the woodcut print represented no less than what he calls an instrument of salvation. Certainly, such was the message delivered by those numerous critics. And in the light of this statement, you might ponder the combination of a political and a religious statement in the work, this large memorial sheet produced by the famous artist Käthe Kollwitz after the murder of communist leader Karl Liebknecht in January 1919. The reverent mood here that combines a workers' solidarity with an iconography for the lamentation of Christ, from the lamentation of Christ, is again exemplary of this era, and also is underlined in fact by for us by Reinhold Heller, that same art historian, when he continues on this medium to say that, I'm quoting, this very medium with its historical and religious heritage was a palliative for the artists, a restorer of strength. Now, I will return in some detail to Käthe Kollwitz on that very theme of reparative strengths. But I think this is the moment to bring in, make brief reference to Ludwig Meidner, not working in woodcut. These originated as pen and ink drawings in a sketchbook that were then produced in lithographic format in various pamphlet and portfolio forms after the war. But as many of you will know, Ludwig Meidner was an artist who took the visionary role of the creative type very much to heart, and himself rode a kind of roller coaster pre-war. He had extraordinary prophetic visions of apocalyptic landscapes, and after the war suffered huge remorse. In contrast to the New Testament themes that we saw with Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, Meidner's Orthodox Jewish heritage gave him recourse to the prophets from the Hebrew Bible. So you see the Jeremiahs and Isaiahs here. These drawings originated in sketchbooks made while he was an interpreter in a prisoner of war camp with French prisoners of war. And the sketches were accompanied by a stream of very vivid prose writings, reflecting on the absurdity of war and the suffering that he had witnessed, and published after the war in a series of publications, including the one called Septemberschrei, or the Cry of September. They again encapsulate this absolutely characteristic sort of ecstatic messianic socialism common to the revolutionary era. Ludwig Meidner soon after that, in fact, left all of that expressionist euphoria behind in a return to religious orthodoxy and artistic realism. But I thought, given the context here of war and prisoners of war, it was essential to show you briefly those drawings. Now back to the woodcut and indeed to some sculpture by Fred Kormis. So that common feeling of a brotherhood of man is exemplified in this woodcut by Konrad Felix Müller on the cover of a radical political journal called Die Aktion, or Action. And here, as I said, is where Fred Kormis comes back in, because if you look at the woodcut to the left, rettet euch Menschen, save yourselves, and you observe these angular bodies of man and woman taking that drastic leap of faith, and then measure these against the sculpture and the forthright gesture, whether that be entreaty or prophecy, then perhaps you can see common formal attributes. The subject here is the new man, neuer Mensch, not exclusively male, of course, a redemptive archetype that appears across art and literature in Germany at this point, and this final wave of expressionist idealism. Inevitably, it was a short-lived phenomenon as economic reality finally eclipsed such messianic hope. So as for the prints that you can see here, I was really astonished to learn of these prints made by the artist while in captivity, lengthy captivity, some 5 years or so in Siberia. And then I went on to learn of, in fact, of the vibrant cultural activities taking place in many of those prisoner of war camps. But firstly, while we're looking at these objects on screen, and some of you will already have seen them on the wall over there, let's just focus in on the works themselves and also what they tell us about the artist's experience before he signed up, was joined up in the Austro-Hungarian army. Essays by Barbara Warnock and others tell us of his practical apprenticeship in a sculptural moulding workshop and evening classes at Frankfurt Polytechnic. The skills acquired here, along with drawing and printmaking activities that were standard to that type of education, have clearly informed these works, which combine a kind of classical style of portraiture with a technical proficiency that clearly shows in his assured handling of the material. If we look at the left-hand work to begin with, the first thing I would point out here, and this is because this is important to the whole revival of printmaking in the early 20th century, is that the effort and attention to detail that mark out this work, not as a study or a copy, as for instance, prints used to be thought of in the 19th century for reproduction purposes, but an artwork in its own right, probably based on a portrait sketch and reduced in keeping with the technical restrictions of the medium to simple emphatic contours and schematic cuts that build towards a kind of rudimentary shading. The art of woodcut, I'll just fill you in briefly on the material details, is carved with a knife in a plank of wood, the vertical plank of wood, in fact, very similar to the type of floorboards, although it wouldn't be oak, it would be a softer wood such as pine, sometimes lime wood. And this meant that when the artist was using the knife, the opportunity to make fine filigree marks, as for instance in an etching or engraving, was not there. Instead, he or she could only produce thick lines that are there, or raised areas that are there after they have carved away the ground, which then prints as white. And it's the raised bars, if you like, that are left that take the ink and are then impressed upon the wood. And that explains this bold sort of matrix that you get. Quite often, the artist would also privilege the natural grain, bringing that sense of material trace. And visually speaking, there is some real artistic agility here, I think, and a kind of agile thinking that requires you, opposite to drawing, where the mark you make is the mark you see, in woodcut you have to work in negative, so that bearing in mind how the areas carved away will form the white spaces around those positive lines. So this is what we're looking at here. And along with those linear contours and facial features, Kormis has animated the background. He's done that by carving with a gouge, a kind of curved chisel, rather than a knife, in order to leave that very visible material trace of tool and hand that was prized by artists of the time. And I'm sure he would have seen works by the Brücke artists, Ernst, Ludwig Kirchner, Haeckel, and especially prior to all of those, Edvard Munch. The right-hand image is a much softer one. It appears to be the same man in profile. And here, that overall veil that appears to cover the underlying woodcut image, I think, is due to the fact that he's actually mixed techniques, which again is something that he might have seen in the work of other artists. Edvard Munch did this a lot, which was first of all to carve the initial image in the block and print it, and then to overlay that with a sort of wash-like effect printed from a lithographic stone. All of which tells us that the materials and the sort of workshop facilities were actually far from primitive in these far-flung Siberian camp, prisoner of war camps. Now, I don't think we know who the sitter is. I'm sure there's been plentiful attempts to find out. Fellow inmate, most likely. And Kormis did give an interview and it's in IWM, Imperial War Museum records, saying that there were plenty of people willing to sit. It could have been a gift or possibly even a paid commission. So to move on to some other works here, despite technical accomplishment, just check my timing. Despite technical accomplishment, these woodcuts don't share the same themes or styles as the works that I began with. It's not surprising, perhaps, given how they were produced in isolation, so far away from avant-garde developments. Principally, what one sees here is the continuation of an academic treatment to the figure, adapted on the right into a symbolic expression of confinement. While the details have been reduced in line with the technical restrictions, nonetheless, the compositions evoke standard poses, such as you might find in a life drawing class. And in fact, this is very likely to have been the context. Because while there isn't a lot of detail on Kormis's own camp experience, interesting articles written based on records from other Austro-Hungarian, Czech, Bohemian prisoners who themselves have trained in Vienna. The records there give us a remarkable picture, in fact, of social life in the camps, in the largest of which there were attempts to create a kind of coffee house culture, such as you might have in Vienna, with artists sitting around sketching each other and penning articles for the camp magazine. And there was also an informal educational structure with art lessons and and we know this from Kormis as well, plentiful access to materials. There were even exhibitions. I read of exhibitions held outside the camps in the city of Vladivostok, for instance, and there was an opportunity to sell works. So there was quite a vibrant, there's even talk of an artist's circle there. It was a very vibrant artist community, and there's also record of how therapeutic this was, how it helped to alleviate the endless gloom of confinement and anxiety. And yes, and it definitely contributed to these materials. If you look, you can perhaps tell when you look quite closely at these prints by Kormis, another factor here which tells us about the location of their production, and that is that he has used quite fine Japanese tissue, such as you would find, for instance, in an art academy or art school in Central Europe, imported from Japan, but how you would get that in a prisoner of war camp, except for the fact that, of course, Vladivostok was in fact under Japanese rule for a time in this revolutionary period. So I think that's an interesting factor. And I think he may even have seen examples of Japanese printmaking while there. But I want to return to his just crossover with his sculptural work. We know that he gained commissions to work both in plaster and in stone, and medallions, often for graves of fellow prisoners and sometimes even local residents. This must be the context of this emphatic mourning motif here, which optimizes the necessary simplification of the technique and shows, in fact, how closely this relief printing technique, how closely it is to sculpture, as if perhaps a motif that he created for a grave has been translated here back into the print format. And I'm going to move on now to show you where I think he might be getting some of his visual ideas from, or in the past. And I would love to know, it's very interesting to think if there was any access in these camps to print media coming from the homelands, for instance, in Red Cross packages and so forth, because in that case, then there would have been an opportunity to keep up with some visual material. Whether or not Kormis had such models, he clearly had a visual memory of works by a sculptor who we know he admired. And this is Ernst Barlach, a sculptor who began, like Kormis, working in ceramics, because that was where his economic opportunities lay. And again, who in fact had his first public breakthrough after his own formative journey to Russia in 1906. The heavy, compact unity and reduced surface detail that is a feature across the works of Ernst Barlach was something that he developed actually while journeying across the vast plains of Ukraine in 1906, where he discovered in relation both to the peasant figures and to the landscape, he said that he had made a breakthrough and he'd learned to see in volumetric terms. He spoke of being able now to create from the inside out. Kormis could well have seen works such as these in exhibition or in reproduction. Undoubtedly, I think he would also have seen the print series, perhaps through his teachers, a major lithographic series that was published in 1910, Der Tote Tag, or The Dead Day. It's a mythological tale. I don't have time to go into the narrative here, but it was Barlach's own invention. He wrote the tale and illustrated it with a whole series of these lithographs, based on the story of a mother desperate to keep her son from entering into the world of his estranged father. Do look it up. There's a series in the V&A. In fact, there's an edition in the V&A. Now, when war broke out in 1914, Barlach, already in his late 40s, was not called up, but he was one of those artists, and this is common to all sides of the conflict, who were seized by a sudden, irrational, we have to think now, wave of euphoria. The rather unattractive German term for this is Hurra-Patriotismus, I have to say. Anyway, in this mode, he began modeling in work a clay that was influenced in part by his own preoccupation with Norse sagas, and also by the sight and sound of troop maneuvers, all gathering at a railway station near his town of Güstrow. And when he created this work, which he initially gave a very mythological name to, he called it a berserker. Those are the sort of crazed warriors clad in bear skins who fight on the side of Odin, I don't know, in some mythological battle. Now it's known as the Avenger. And although I'm showing you here a wooden version carved after the war, he first modeled this in clay in 1914. And in his diary at the time, he registered a sense of catharsis, or even a sense perhaps of joining in the war effort, because he wrote that the berserker is the crystallization of war, the storm against all obstacle that gives us faith. And you can see a version of this when it's on show in Tate Modern. It's a bronze, there's a bronze which was cast in 1932. Now, in Barlach's later print series, we see this archetype leave the ground in a series of hovering figures. These two prints from his series known as The Transformations of God, again, actually no text for this series, meditations in effect on the human relationship to the divine. But what I want to point out here in the first and second is the very sculptural treatment of the garment folds, more rigid in the first day and more fluid in the God that hovers over those numerous cathedrals. And also in that God, have a look at that pronounced sort of bright shelf that is formed where his shoulders are. Bear that in mind. Now, the cathedrals in this image are largely Gothic, but the carving with its broad and rhythmic sort of banding recalls, in fact, the earlier Romanesque period tradition seen on portals, capitals, and so forth in churches across Europe. And this was a style that Fred Kormis also favoured, as related in conversations with David Aronson, who has written for the catalogue. Since so little of Kormis's work has survived, we have to rely on old photographs. But even here, I think, there is a striking resemblance, in fact, between the emphatic sort of rope-like banding of the garments on these plaster models and those of Barlach's figures. And at the time, there's a small mention of Kormis in an exhibition review on the wall back there from the Frankfurter Zeitung in the 1920s. And it mentions there the calm and decisive simplicity of his work. And I like to think that there is, again, there's a sort of parallel there between the two artists. Now, Barlach's own engagement with woodcut printing began immediately after the war, in fact, in the closing months of the war in 1918, and in relation to another prisoner of war camp encounter. On the outskirts of the town of Güstrow, which is in the northern sort of Lake District of Mecklenburg, was a large camp housing Russian prisoners. And Barlach met here the emigre Russian author Reinhold von Walter, who worked as a translator in the camp. Reinhold's bitterly ironic tale, Der Kopf, or The Head, presented our artist, Barlach, with a theme in which to express his own despair at the destitution brought by war and revolution. It tells the story of a world turned upside down, where beggars are worshipped as idols, and the desperate masses have put a severely disabled man on the throne, the eponymous head. The narrative, in fact, gave the artist full rein to exploit the medieval associations of this art form. Amongst scenes of plenty of people seriously in need of a miracle, you might spot another version of that heavily clad archetype that I pointed to just now, where you see the beggar here at the forefront of this right-hand image, who drags himself along on his hands, and consider how that mighty avenger has fallen. Barlach was by this time a well-known playwright and printmaker alongside sculpture. His first experiments with woodcut were the result of material shortages, but equally a desire for the physical and mental engagement that comes with the art of carving. The urgency is very plain in lines that he writes to a friend at the time when he announces, lately, in order not to fall apart, I have thrown myself into the woodcut. It is furious work. Several series followed. For a while, he worked exclusively in woodcut, and in 1919, he worked on a series of single sheets, which deserve particular mention, in part for the themes, which again, very visibly have to do with war and upheaval, and which he described as having to do with the misery of his own times. The masterpiece amongst these, far and away, is his Christ in Gethsemane. Now, this is adapted, of course, from Renaissance traditions of the Passion of Christ. Albrecht Dürer, Hans Holbein the Younger, in particular. But this Christ figure, adapted from those Renaissance models, belongs unequivocally in the contemporary secular world of destitute and remorseful types. It's a work marked out by its rhythmic unity that, while the central Christ figure is magnified, belongs in the same sort of rhythmic continuity that incorporates the landscape of the Mount of Olives and the sleeping apostles enfolded in humps in the roots there of those trees. Such compact design and linear density requires immense concentration. And it was an exercise that for Barlach, again, was a very emotional one, and one that appears to have helped him to work through his feelings about the war. He talks of it as a confession, writing to a cousin this time. It is a technique that forces a confession, compels one to say in no uncertain terms what one really means. What does he have to confess? Well, from reading his war diary, I can tell you that the belligerent euphoria that was encapsulated in that berserker figure very soon gave way to abject despair as he heard the hospital trains rolling by in the night and numerous records of casualties amongst his acquaintances. He himself was even called up for a while in training, and the experience was, even that was traumatic enough. I think we see this collapse of morale, in fact, in the figure of Christ here, where we can think how the warrior has stumbled, how even the mystic has perhaps fallen from the sky and taken on the body language of the prisoner or indeed the refugee. Now, Käthe Kollwitz was a prolific printmaker and sculptor throughout her long career. Only a few months into the war, in October 1914, she lost her youngest son on the Belgian front. Unable to work at all for some time, it eventually took her almost 10 years to produce a work that would express that grief. Now, this charcoal drawing on the right from December 1915 is related to this lengthy process. What she had in, it actually originally was based on a very sort of sad sight of her parents sitting around looking dejected around the Christmas tree. But when she works the drawing up, she gives it the features of herself and her husband, Carl, sitting around a very sparse Christmas tree, and in the space where, in fact, their son perhaps should be between them. By this time, she had actually begun work on a sculpture, a monumental memorial she had in mind, which was to take the form of the outstretched body of Christ, not Christ, but with a Christian reference again of her son, with the two parents, her and her husband, mourning at either end. She got as far as a large-scale plaster model, but continually she felt frustrated, and she felt this composition with its sort of conventional motif and style just wasn't adequate to her strength of feeling. So she destroyed the plaster, and she wrote in frustration in her diary, "Where is the new form for the content of these years?" Finally, in 1918, this is when she abandoned sculpture and embarked instead on a print series. This, she felt, would give her scope to express both that personal and the universal loss experienced by those around her. 2 years of work later, first in etching, and then when that seemed too refined, in lithograph, she came across in June 1920 the work of Ernst Barlach, his woodcuts that I have been showing you, including the Christ, on exhibition in Berlin. Immediately then, she recognized the form that would be adequate to her own grief. And she declared herself in her diary that night to be bowled over. She wrote further that Barlach has found his way, and I have not as yet found mine. It's at that point that she sets about working these motifs into a series of 7 woodcut prints, all of which deal with the experience on the home front, in contrast to other war graphics that you might be familiar with, for instance, the monumental etching series by Otto Dix. It does so in a sequence of 7 plates, which follow a trajectory that maps her own feelings from a sense of patriotic sort of heroism, where she felt she should support her son's wish to go to war, through the abject grief, and finally to a defiance, a sort of mute defiance that you will find marks out the final print. The first sheets here that I'm showing you is in this heroic mode, a sort of symbolist image of sacrifice, but a very vulnerable one, where a woman in her nakedness, after just giving birth, offers her newborn child as if in service to a great cause. And this and the volunteers were faithful, as I say, to that patriotic spirit, which swept Peter and his friends into the arms of death, effectively. And in that print of the volunteers, Peter is the figure with the sharp features just next to the figure of death there. They're using minimum means for maximum effect here. The stark material choices of woodcut have condensed that band of brothers into one unified wave suspended under an ecstatic rainbow. The tragedy that she experienced is crystallized in the grieving parents, as is the shift in her formal. We see here really that she has arrived at that form that she was looking for when she said, where is the form for the content of these years? Supporting each other in their sorrow, hands standing in for faces, the fused figures create a new monument to replace that abandoned plaster model. The parents who in the original sculptural format had stood at head and foot are now united in one immutable block, which could as well bring to mind a headstone for a graveyard, the solid relief chiseled against an empty background and overlaid with those sparse white lines. Placed towards the end of the series, the mothers stamps an impression of resolute defiance on our perception, I would say. It's an impenetrable weave of mothers, those voluble hands again, clasping a single protective cloak around their precious children. And finally, she was able to, having finished this series, she was able to remark, in fact, she wrote a letter to the French pacifist author, Henri Barbusse. Oh no, it might have been Romain Rolland instead, forgive me. And she said that finally, when she produced this series, she had finally found the means to express what she said we have all suffered during these unspeakably difficult years. Right, I am coming towards the end of my lecture in a few more slides. It wasn't until 1932 that Kollwitz was finally able to realize in stone the ultimate memorial to her son, which was erected at the cemetery and graveyard where he had fallen. It has since been moved along because grave commissions do this, but it's now in place in Władysław Cemetery, not far from the original. And here we see that same parental couple who first appeared in the sketch around the Christmas tree and then were bound together in the woodcut. In their original setting, the figures were placed on either side of the entrance to the cemetery, which meant that any visitor would walk through the space and feel themselves that empty space, the absence of the loved one who they had come to mourn. And I think that there's something here about this intense gravity of these sculptures, isolated in their personal pain, and yet united in these compact volumes that shape them from within, that keeps the viewer at a respectful distance while also inviting our own introspection on grief and loss. And this gravity is something that it would appear Kollwitz has arrived at through her work in the woodcut series, working more and more towards a kind of monumental, simple but bold format. Now, just as Kollwitz was beginning work on that pair, the artist Ernst Barlach was commissioned by his hometown of Güstrow to create a war memorial for the cathedral, and it hangs there today. Well, there's a story behind that, but a replica hangs there today, avoiding either a thrusting heroism or a prostrate grief. In fact, for his memorial, he looks back to those hovering archetypal figures to create an angel figure, arms crossed and eyes closed, as if in mute acceptance of a universal fate. When you stand and contemplate this heavy bronze hanging a couple of meters above the floor, the experience is quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, you feel the gravity, and at the same time, you feel a dematerialization, as if all weight has transcended along with the expression. Look at the face. Those of you familiar with the work of Käthe Kollwitz, especially her later self-portraits, might recognize here a likeness. He has indeed adopted the face of his fellow artist, but according to Barlach himself, he did this unconsciously. And yet, evidently, there is a deep empathy between the two artists working in these similar mediums and on very similar themes, which I think has brought this about. So this brings us back to Fred Kormis and his memorial at Dollis Hill, which was made in the same non-partisan, universal sentiment that characterizes the work that I've been showing you by Barlach and Kollwitz. And if you haven't made it to the front of the room here, you will see on this wall, interestingly, a postcard of a single figure which Kormis contributed to a sort of complex war memorial at the battleground known as Tannenberg in, I think, East Prussia, somewhere quite far east in German territory at that time. And no doubt, if you read the inscription here, you will note that this was dismantled under the Nazi regime, probably melted down, because that memorial was not partisan enough. In other words, it was not heroic. It did not glorify that storm of steel embodied, apparently, according to Nazi ideology, by German soldiers. The same fate befell Barlach's angel. It was melted down and the bronze contributed to armaments in 1937. And the distress, in fact, caused by that for Barlach, who already had a weak heart, was probably a contributor to his death a year later. The reason we have these sculptures today is because, extraordinarily, because it's quite a large object, it's at least 2 meters long and perhaps 1 meter in depth, the cast had been hidden in the woods outside Barlach's studio and was then recovered post-war. And so subsequent moldings were made. And one of them was placed back in the cathedral, which was in the DDR at that time. And another was given to the city of Cologne in a gesture of sort of humanitarian recognition. Kollwitz's work that I showed you, The Parents, only erected in 1932, escaped such a fate. But had it taken her a year longer, it would never have been allowed to stand as a memorial to German soldiers. So that effectively completes the bulk of my lecture, but I have one last slide, which is a sort of coda, because it shares the context, both material, perhaps I'd already moved on. There we go. Because it shares a context that's both sort of thematic and material. And here, I'd like to make reference to contemporary German artist, Georg Baselitz, and his major work of memorial produced in 1989. I'm showing you 2 individual panels from a large composite work that consists of 20 individual works, all displayed as a grid, and now in the Kunsthaus Zurich in Switzerland. Entitled 45, simply, this monumental work is itself a cathartic act of commemoration, because Barlach was 7 years old and living in a town about 30 kilometers from Dresden when the catastrophic firebombing took place. And while in relative safety there with his mother, he could never forget the devastating sight of the stream of refugees coming from the city in those terrifying February nights. At first glance, when you look at these works, you might be looking at a series of color woodcuts in outsized format. And I haven't given the dimensions, but they're about 2 meters by 1, roughly. No, not 2, over 1 by nearly 1. In fact, these are paintings on wood, but cut they certainly are, and gouged, in fact, in a kind of frenzied rhythm that both in the individual works and when you see the whole as a grid, suggest an urban grid of streets locked in and backlit by an almighty conflagration. And enmeshed in those crude architectonic details, there are figures that appear to either be trapped or to hover just above the surface, those vividly colored female characters who stare at us in panic, unlikely to escape the scene. That was Barlach's attempt to both commemorate, but also for himself to work through the trauma of living through such traumatic war experiences. And that really does conclude my lecture. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for such a rich and enlightening lecture. I was just really spellbound by it, really. So thank you so much. Just a couple of quick things before I allow questions. Just to say that Nicola mentioned the catalogue. So if you'd like to buy the catalogue, it is on sale tonight, and you can approach one of our staff and we can sell that to you. And also on the subject of Käthe Kollwitz's face, we have a very powerful photograph of Kollwitz in our collection, and there is a postcard of that if you'd like to look at it there as well, taken sort of during these years, kind of late 20s, early 30s. That's just another connection. But now to turn to you and see if anybody has any questions. If I could ask if people could just wait till I bring a mic round, because we are actually making a recording and it won't pick up what you say unless we use the mics.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that talk. Very moving pictures and sculptures, wood blocks. I'd like to make a connection, which I wonder if you know about or others, with the Chinese woodblock movement, which started more or less at the same time, but strongly in the 1930s, under the aegis and encouragement of the Chinese writer Lu Xun.
Yes.
In Shanghai, where he gathered a group of students of the woodblock skill or art and encouraged them to develop that form of art to express the tragedy, the struggles of the time. Of course, in the Chinese context, it came to the Japanese invasion of China and the traumas that the people experienced in similar style.
Yes.
Obviously, much influenced, and Lu Xun himself paid tribute to Käthe Kollwitz,
Yes.
and I think met her in he died in 1936.
Yes, it was an explicit reference. You're right. I know something about this. So I think Lu Xun must have visited Berlin. Certainly, Kollwitz did not travel to China, although she did go to Russia. They could have met there, I suppose. But yes, it was a revival of China's own ancient art form, which is what triggered the European Middle Age sort of art form in the Middle Ages. So it was like sort of a reciprocal, if you like, sort of revival. And I think it's particularly when you see those works by Lucien, I can see actually how they definitely animate certain motifs from the prints of Käthe Kollwitz. It's a fascinating connection, and one that also picks up on the woodcut for its a sort of very bold and emotional rendering of a politically intense period. So yes, thank you for mentioning that.
I just wondered where, if anywhere, Emil Nolde, very much not a left-winger, fits into this school, or not.
Yes, absolutely. In the early years, you're quite right. And thank you for mentioning Emil Nolde. He's a hot potato when it comes to Nazism. But in his early years, he was certainly courted by those expressionist artists, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and Haeckel, who he did join the Brücke group for a year. And his very visceral, very sort of primitive, rudimentary woodcuts, some of which are here in the British Museum, are very much in line with that material authenticity and this sense of a sort of honest materiality. So yes, he was an extraordinary printmaker, although now he might be best known for his color works in painting. But Emil Nolde was there at the beginning, in around after 1905, really in an expressionist circles that really privileged original printmaking as an experimental art form. Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, right. Did you have a question?
I don't know if this is going to be the form of a question, but it's sort of more of an observation about the connection you made between the wood carving and the psychology and the catharsis and emotion. And this word distress came to my mind, but how they distress the material, the artist, in to express their grief and their outpouring of emotion. There's some great ones at the end there. The ones made by the female artists I particularly appreciated. I don't know if I really have a question, but something about this connection was very evocative, I thought.
Thanks. Well, it's great to underline that. I'm glad that came across, because I do think, I mean, there's evidence from their diaries, and but also I think also evidence from the way these prints were received, often, you know, in sort of characteristically ecstatic terms by some of the expressionist critics, but all the time you get these quite physiological terminology being used about as if the eye itself has been wounded by looking at these things. And then from the artist's point of view, I quoted Barlach saying that it was like a confession. There's a sort of emotional involvement, this deep concentration. And Kollwitz herself, she suffered terrible depression for years. And she really felt that after 1922, when she'd finished work on this series, of course, a long time had gone by, but nonetheless, she said that her depression had lifted. So, and I'm interested in looking at that theme across the works of this era, in fact. So, yes, absolutely. I think there's something here about this intense, both physical and mental concentration that does have a therapeutic effect. And I think that transmits also to the viewer.
Yes, and I hope with Kormis that, or he had this decades-long preoccupation with trying to memorialize being a prisoner of war, and I hope had some positive impact on his psychology as well. So, any other questions? Yes.
Less than a question than a remark for people, because you might more likely end up in Cologne than in Güstrow.
Yeah.
The sculpture is in the Antonita Church, which is quite in the center. So It's easily accessible. And if I'm not very much mistaken, a copy of the grieving father and mother is also in Cologne, also in the center. But because I discovered it by just wandering around, it's not far from the cathedral. I know that because it's in the center and it's in a ruin of a church. But I can't now tell you what it's called or which street it is in. So, and of course, Barlach ended up in the novel from Anders as well. Zanzibar oder Der letzte Grund is the German title, and I don't really know what the English title is. But
yes, I think I would translate that novel as Zanzibar or Bust. And in fact, I read it for A level, and that's when so all those years ago, some time ago now, and that's how I discovered Ernst
because I have
Barlach.
friends that
Yeah, it was a
read it as well.
text from the GDR, and yeah. But yes, thank you for pointing out Cologne, because Cologne has a principal collection of Käthe Kollwitz works. There's a museum there, but it also has, yes, it also has this version of Barlach's Angel, and in the ruins of a church, a replica of those granite parents. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming and for your interesting questions and comments. And if you'd just like to join me now, once again, in thanking Nicola for a fantastic talk. So, yes, our bookshop is open, and also we, as I say, have further events in this event series, including one on the 12th of November next week. So hope to see you again soon, and thank you very much.